As France, Italy, and others on this continent wonder if the working class voters who now opt for conservatives or the far right will ever again return to the left, the sight of a U.S. president walking a picket line in support of striking auto workers certainly grabbing headlines here. We'll ask about Joe Biden's embrace of his blue-collar roots and his open support for trade unions. Trade unions often seen as an endangered species on both sides of the Atlantic. Biden in Michigan, one day before Donald Trump's own pitch to auto workers, albeit at a non-union plant outside Detroit. It was so-called Reagan Democrats who switched allegiances in 2016 to put Trump over the line in key Midwest Rust Belt states that include Michigan. What's the message they want to hear now in 2024? More broadly, what does the United States want? 4 decades after Ronald Reagan busted unions and said government was the problem, what to make of high-profile strikes everywhere from the auto industry to Hollywood? Will regulation and the role of government in guaranteeing a social safety net be on the ballot in these uncertain post-COVID times? Today in the France 24 debate, we're talking about the battle for blue-collar votes. Joining us from St. Louis, political strategist Jason Rowe is former chair of the Michigan Republican Party. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
And joining us here in the studio, we're with Ellen Kuntz, Dean of Finance, the Finance Department at the INSEC Business School. Welcome back.
Happy to be here today. Thank you.
We miss seeing him in the France 24 newsroom. Journalist Cole Stangler, you have a forthcoming book. It's called Paris is Not Dead, out on October 17th. The quick pitch?
About gentrification in Paris, how the city's changing, what to do to keep it affordable.
Okay. The France 24 debate, where you could join the conversation you have on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. He answered the invitation of the head of the striking United Auto Workers Union on Tuesday. Joe Biden on the picket line in Wayne County, Michigan, a first for a sitting U.S. president.
The fact of the matter is that you guys, the UAW, you saved the automobile industry back in 2008 and before. Made a lot of sacrifices, gave up a lot, and the companies were in trouble. But now they're doing incredibly well. And guess what? You should be doing incredibly well, too.
Now, all of those who met Biden on the day found him personable. Will they all vote for him come November of next year, though?
For him coming here himself, that makes me proud, and I'm sure a lot of the rest of us as well.
I wouldn't vote for keeping the borders open like they are, or the abortion situation. Those are pretty big that I wouldn't support a Democrat.
Okay, so Jason Rowe, they liked him, but they're not all going to vote for him. Your thoughts on the optics of Joe Biden in Michigan?
Well, clearly it was a response to former President Trump saying that he was going to come and speak to the workers, though he did go to a non-union facility and talk to maybe retired auto workers more than active UAW members. But, you know, Michigan is at play, and I think one of Donald Trump's superpowers in American politics is he was able to win Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania in 2016, and no Republican's been able to do that since the 1980s. And so those states for the first time are in play. I think that Trump has forced a realignment of the traditional coalitions of the parties, where I think pre-Trump, the view of most voters was that Republicans represented the elites and Democrats the working class. He changed that. You know, it made the party far more grassroots. When you look at polling, that, you know, college-educated voters now are overwhelmingly voting Democrat, and non-college-educated voters are overwhelmingly voting Republican. Mm-hmm. So I think, you know, for him, it was a great move in terms of trolling the Republican candidates in the debate by not participating and getting involved.
We'll talk more in a moment, Jason, about Donald Trump, but just again about Joe Biden, because you know, it really grabbed headlines in this country to see. We've had our president, when he was on the campaign trail, meet with striking workers, but to actually go and support picketers, Americans take that in stride?
I think some do, but I think it is the first time we've ever seen anything like that. And to take sides in something this big and to line up with labor. I mean, the protests that you have in France so frequently, if all of a sudden, the president was marching with them, I'm certain it would shake heads there. But, it's because he knows that Trump is making a strong play for those voters. And I think he felt he had to do it. And he did probably neutralize a bit the impact of Trump's appearance.
Ellen Kuntz, what were people telling you here in France when they saw those images of Joe Biden on a picket line?
I'm not sure that it's as shocking as we could have imagined years back, because there were so few picketers, because there are so few unionized workers in these times. So the lack of participation on the union side made it a very sparse crowd. So I think that that's why it maybe didn't impact as much as it could have had there. It wasn't the UAW, United Auto Workers Union, from back in the day. But
everyone's been billing this as unprecedented. They're striking at the big three automakers.
I think we're so over unprecedented, thanks to having had 4 years of Donald Trump in the White House, where every day it's something unprecedented, even now.
Just a few things to add, I think, here, just in response to what Jason said. I mean, Joe Biden visiting the picket line was not in response to Donald Trump going. Joe Biden visited that picket line because he knows he needs to get the endorsement from the UAW, and the UAW has withheld that endorsement so far.
This is the Auto Workers Union.
United Auto Workers Union leading this strike. So Joe Biden was visiting that picket line to show that the UAW that he supports them, and also because he understands that siding with organized labor is politically popular today in the United States.
But how popular is it if Ellen Kuntz says there's fewer people on the picket line?
Yeah, I don't quite agree with that portrait either of what's going on. I mean, the strike here, you have thousands of workers that are going on strike. We haven't had a strike at all three big three automakers ever taking place at the same time. And you have, also just to get back to the optics from Biden's perspective, again, not about Trump, but about showing a president that's siding with working people and siding with organized labor. Polls in the U.S. today show you have approval ratings for unions at their highest levels since the 1960s. You have, around 67%, I think, according to the most recent poll, saying they approve of the union. So it's a politically popular move to support unions and to show the UAW that he's listening to them. So I think those are the optics. I think then what happened afterwards is Donald Trump visiting, which we can talk about that, maybe this
let's talk about it.
Plan.
Donald Trump's courtship of the United Auto Workers Union also shifting into high gear, pardon the pun. An endorsement, though, could seem like an uphill battle. Let's first listen to the head of that union.
I don't think he cares about working class people. I think that he cares about the billionaire class. He cares about the corporate interest. I think he's just trying to pander to people and say what they want to hear.
Okay, so he hasn't won that endorsement yet, but Trump's still making his pitch to striking auto workers on Wednesday. First, he toured a non-union parts manufacturer and supplier outside of Detroit before taking the stage.
To the striking workers, I support you in your goal of fair wages and greater stability, and I truly hope you get a fair deal for yourselves and your families. But if your union leaders will not demand that Crooked Joe repeal his electric vehicle mandate immediately, then it doesn't matter what hourly wage you get. It just doesn't make a damn bit of difference, because in 2 to 3 years, you will not have one job in this state. And you've seen it happen before.
All right, several points to unpack in what we just heard there. By the way, Cole Stengler, you're not the only one who's got a forthcoming book. We're pleased to welcome Patrick Ruffini from Washington, your pollster. Your forthcoming book is called Party of the People: Inside the Multiracial Populist Coalition Remaking the GOP. Thanks for joining us here on the France 24 debate.
Thank you for having me.
Listening to Trump and Biden, which sits better with, again, in this climate of industrial action in the United States?
Yes. So I think that regardless of the pronouncements of the union leader, so we heard a union leader who is politically joined at the hip with the Biden administration and a union movement that is largely a part of the Democratic coalition, making a very political statement. But however, when you look at how these rank and file members are voting, and particularly in a state like Michigan, particularly in a year like 2016, and continuing to some extent into 2020, Donald Trump got more of the votes of the rank and file, regardless of the pronouncements of the union leaders. Now,
so why didn't he make his campaign appearance before a union shop?
Well, I think you'd have to ask his campaign that question. But I do think that regardless, I mean, I think the numbers are clear that really Donald Trump, years and years, let's go back to 2012, the Mitt Romney candidacy, when he published an op-ed saying let Detroit go bankrupt. He notoriously struggled, I think, to gain the support of working class people. He said 47% of the country did not, they take from the government, and that's not the productive people in the country. And then you had just a different attitude with Donald Trump coming in. So talking about jobs moving to Mexico, jobs moving to China, stopping the outflow of jobs. And that really resonated, really in 2016. And the proof in the pudding with him winning the state of Michigan that year and coming very close again in 2020. Yeah, well,
there was, and I'll put it to you, Jason Rowe, in that clip, we heard Donald Trump taking aim at Joe Biden for his recovery plan, which includes big subsidies for electric vehicles. And we're starting to see kind of the same argument here in Europe. Is going green going to be one of those divisive campaign issues?
Well, I actually think that's really the underlying argument that the UAW is going for more benefits because of. You've got in the state of Michigan and a lot of other places where we're giving the autos billions of dollars. The feds are giving the autos billions of dollars to create electric vehicles and phasing out combustible engines. And when they're doing this, they're creating joint operations with other companies like LG and Goshen, the Chinese-owned battery maker, and they're using non-union labor for those new jobs. And so I think there's a fundamental moment here for union in which this change from combustible engines to electric vehicles is going to eliminate a lot of the current union jobs. So I think that is driving this. And I think the big problem that Biden has right now is two of his biggest constituencies, the environmentalists and organized labor, are now at odds over this very big fight. And so he's kind of in the middle of this thing. And I do think electric vehicles and the mandates associated with them. I mean, listen, anyone, free market, you can get an electric vehicle if that's what you want. But the autos are being forced to make these electric vehicles. And there's a lot of change going on in our economy and in our country related to those changes to the industry.
Cole Stangler?
Yeah, I mean, I think a few things. I'm not quite sure where to begin. I think when we're talking about the strike, why are auto workers on strike today? They're on strike because they're asking for higher wages, and they're asking for an end to two-tier wages, so newer workers coming in making less than veteran workers. They're asking for more pay, and so we haven't been talking about that. I think it's just an important point to stress. So the backdrop of electric vehicles is sort of part of the conversation, but workers are asking for higher pay. And I think that's important just to put in the conversation. Secondly, when we're talking about the way union members vote, just to correct, I think, some things that we heard, union members still vote for Democrats more than Republicans. I think it's just an important point to stress, including in states in the Midwest. It's true that Trump has cut into some of that support, but union members still vote for Democrats. And then thirdly, just I think an important point to nuance here when we're talking about the working class, a word we hear thrown around a lot, used a lot. What are we really talking about here? Are we talking about people without a college education, in which case Trump did have a slight advantage over Biden in the last election, and polls show that today? Or are we talking about income? You look at the lowest income bracket in the United States, those voters overwhelmingly voted for Joe Biden in the last election and still support Democrats over Republicans. If we're talking about white voters that don't have college educations, it's true that group of the electorate votes for Trump. I think it's just worth nuancing the discussion a little bit when we're talking about sort of working class.
Trump made the argument that those voters who were listening to him Wednesday night, they can't afford to buy those electric vehicles.
Yeah, and I think, if Donald Trump, again, I mean, this is something that I think the union, leaders have pointed out as well. Sean Fain, who's not, by the way, joined at the hip with the Biden administration, much closer to Bernie Sanders, who, by the way, has spoken at events. They're asking Donald Trump, if he wanted to support the unions, could say, let's have higher pay. He doesn't support that. He could say, let's have some higher taxes.
He says he supports the strikers.
Does he really? Does he support those demands of the 40% wage hike that they're asking for? Does he support making it easier for workers to join unions?
He says, I support you in your goal of fair wages.
Okay, well, he was also president for 4 years in which he had an opportunity to decide with organized labor. He didn't.
Ellen
I
Kuntz.
agree. He was, I think it's just word salad from Donald Trump. Clearly, there's an underlying fundamental issue here, which is the working class has shifted toward the working poor in many places. And that question of the affordability of the vehicles is a real question. I'm not sure that it's Donald Trump who has the answer. But clearly, what used to be a solid working class has become a fragile working poor. And at the same time, Americans want a lot of really incompatible choices. They want well-paying jobs for themselves, but they also want cheap or inexpensive products for themselves. And this question of environmentally friendly vehicles or not going forward, it seems incredible that that's up for debate and that it's going to, unfortunately, become a political football.
But we're seeing it here in France. We're seeing it in neighboring Germany. We're having the same arguments.
I think that maybe there's an opening to solve the problem of making our own batteries and not have to import them from China, and that might be a big part of the solution. I don't know how technically feasible it is, but it seems extraordinary to be able to build a very sophisticated car and not the battery that charges it.
Ellen Kuntz, interesting. You mentioned what voters want. And sometimes the things that a voter wants are contradictory. It's true now, Patrick Ruffini. You've had COVID. Are the voters of 2024, do they want a bigger social safety net? Do they want a government that protects? Or do they want the free market?
I think that they, particularly when you look at the workers, what they fundamentally want is jobs and job stability and security. And they want their job to be there not just today and not that be just a job that pays well today, but it's going to be a job that lasts long into the future. And that means making sure their industries kind of are doing well into the future. And I do think that that is a concern that I think a lot of workers have with this green transition, that this idea of we're going to take the industries of today and those are going to go away, and then there's going to be this new green economy that replaces it. Well, what happens to those unionized workers, right, who are not necessarily part of that green economy? Even if this transition happens, even if it's a good thing in the long term, it's very hard, I think, to convince people in the short term. And you've seen what's happened in the coal industry in a state like West Virginia that has been completely decimated. And you have Joe Biden, basically saying, yeah, we want to get rid of the coal industry. You've had Democrats saying that explicitly. I also just think that, regarding the point about union members voting Democratic on a majority, I think that's only the case because the vast majority of union members in the United States are public sector unions, teachers, government workers, and not the auto workers. So I think the auto workers, I think this whole green transition, right, is fundamentally, I think, at odds with, I think, the working class today because it often
but hang on a sec. Is it the green transition or is it the fact that you've had, first, there was the outsourcing of jobs through globalization. Then there was robotization. Sorry, I'm having trouble with that word. You have the fact that there's been big upheaval with the economy going digital. It's not just a green transition that's upended the global economy and the U.S. economy.
But that's globalization was first, and the green transition is next, right? Because, what you're seeing across industries and across different places is that, the cost of these electric vehicles is just much higher than the cost of a conventional gas vehicle. Likewise, the cost of housing in a lot of places is much more expensive because you have these environmental reviews. And as a result, in a blue state like California, you can't build housing, right? So there's just so many instances where, yeah, I think we need the market, right? We need the market involved to bring down these costs so we can have a cleaner economy. But the concern is with, the Biden EV mandate specifically, that I don't think anyone felt like they were really voting for in 2020, is that you're forcing a transition, and you're forcing a transition maybe before the industry is ready, before the supply chains are ready, and it's going to involve really just higher costs on the consumer, right? Obviously we're focused on workers, but the main driving force behind the dissatisfaction with Joe Biden right now, and the reason why he has that 40% job approval rating is rising costs, and it doesn't seem like these new rules are helping with that.
So, but one thing is clear and is fact, as Cole was mentioning, and that is that you have the call for higher pay. And we're seeing it's not just unprecedented coordinated strikes with the big three automakers over in Michigan making headlines. Hollywood writers have settled after actors joined their movement earlier this week. But there's been industrial action in a whole host of places since COVID. I guess, Jason Rowe, to put it bluntly, how much has America changed since COVID?
Oh, I think COVID was an accelerant of some things that were already happening. I think there's some references made to Mitt Romney and his inability to kind of connect with working class voters. That's where you started to see the fissure, I think, within the electorate, is that Barack Obama overperformed with white working class voters. And then, Mitt Romney, who everyone thought was probably going to win, ended up not winning. And a big part of it is he smelled like Wall Street to a lot of those voters and didn't seem like a guy that they could trust. I do think when you look at UPS, UPS drivers are getting $170,000 a year. I don't know the terms of the writers' settlement and what they're looking at, but take a look at what the UAW's ask is. Currently, UAW workers are getting paid with benefits $66 an hour. The UAW demands would drive that up to $136 per hour. Right now, the non-union Japanese automakers and Tesla are paying $45 per hour. So, you're going to drive up the cost of American-made autos, and it's going to be to the benefit of the Japanese-made and the Tesla. And let's face it, the Tesla is always going to be a sexier electric vehicle than anything the American
But Jason,
autos.
isn't it just a redressing of decades of underpaying those who have hard jobs?
Well, right now, if you take $66 an hour, that's about $120,000 a year without even, having a college degree. I wouldn't say that's underpaying. I'd say that's a pretty good living wage, particularly in a state that's relatively low cost like Michigan. Again, I think I go back to what's happening with the electric vehicles. In my hometown of Lansing, Michigan, General Motors was given $819 million of taxpayer money for EV transition. And what did they do? They created a joint operation with LG, and they're hiring non-union workers. So I think this is about the existence of the UAW jobs over the long term more than it is the pay. But anytime there's a new contract coming up, if you don't think they're going to ask for more pay, you don't understand labor negotiations. But I do, at the end of the day, think this is more about EVs than it is just getting about a better wage.
EVs, electric vehicles. Cole Stangler.
Yeah, I mean, that's not what the members of the UAW say. It's not what the union itself says. And I find, I'm sorry, I have to say, I find it interesting. I've always, when people say that workers shouldn't be being paid, shouldn't be being paid more, especially, people that seem to be doing quite well. I mean, I think it's quite interesting. So since we're talking about numbers, I think it's important to lay out the facts here about the auto companies, which are doing spectacularly well. So $250 billion in profits over the last decade. Let's look at the executive compensation of these CEOs, making over $20 million each. They make 300 times more what workers are making. So I think I think Americans support the strike because they see the workers standing up for a pretty just cause, which is to have maybe share just a little bit more of those immense profits that the companies are making.
So it's always the question about America, because Americans are aspirational. This mantra that you too could be Rockefeller. How do they feel about the CEO who earns a lot of money? Here in France, we have a different attitude, perhaps.
Well, I mean, I think things have been so out of whack, and to use a popular expression. I mean, in the general scheme that now, we're seeing the backlash, I think, to decades of soaring CEO pay, this massive inequality that I think is really important to stress to non-Americans, just how unequal of a place the United States is, how difficult it is to work in the U.S. if you're a low-wage worker and if you're not protected by a union contract, where you don't have that job stability, you don't have that higher pay that comes from being in a union. It's a very difficult place. And we've had for decades this gap that's been growing, and I think we're starting to see some backlash to it, which again is why Americans, it's true, fewer Americans belong to unions than in the past. We're around 10% union density, so 10% of the workforce belonging to unions. But overall, they support unions like they did back in the 1960s because, again, I think it comes down to this fundamental question of this, what you could call the one-sided class war that we've seen in the United States over decades against working people.
Ellen Kuntz, are you feeling the pendulum swing? How when it comes to the role of unions, the role of big institutions?
Well, I would totally agree that we're in a phase where wealth distribution needs to be realigned. And that's really something that brings together the auto worker strike with the writer strike out in California. What is a living wage today is a really important question. And sometimes the numbers might seem inflated, but the fact of the matter is, as you were saying, on the ground, life is extraordinarily expensive in the United States. Parallel to this, there was another fight that was on for a long time. It was called the Fight for $15 minimum wage an hour. It finally went through in many places. And when you go to those places now, it's like, wow, like $50 for breakfast in New York City. But that's thanks to the Fight for 15, because it makes a fair living wage for the people who made you that breakfast.
So the prices have gone up as a result.
A lot.
Right. And this issue of inflation is, of course, another one that I guess will be talked about all the way to November of 2024. We were talking about the fact that the two candidates in Michigan, one of those battleground states, after relentlessly traveling there during the campaign. This is the map from 2016. Donald Trump upsetting Hillary Clinton by a mere 10,000 votes back then. 4 years ago, it was Joe Biden who turned the tide. Both campaigns worked tirelessly. Joe Biden winning by 150,000 votes. Turnout surged to 71% in Michigan on election day. So both sides pulled out all the stops. Now, the governor of Michigan has often been likened of late to Joe Biden for the way she makes her pitch to working class voters, like last week when she appeared at a Detroit rally alongside left-wing Senator Bernie Sanders to support those striking auto workers.
Because we all want the same thing, our chance at a good life, a fair shot. We all want to be able to make it in Michigan for us and for our families. And we are all on Team Michigan. So we will continue to fight to ensure that every worker is treated with dignity and respect, and that Michigan continues to lead the world. So I am here with you.
Jason Rowe, for viewers who don't know her around the world, Gretchen Whitmer's name is coming up more and more. They say there's this nightmare scenario because Joe Biden beat Donald Trump in 2020. And that is, if Biden would have to face a candidate who is not Donald Trump, can the same be said in the other way around? If Joe Biden were not the candidate in 2024 and had to face a Gretchen Whitmer, would it be easier or harder for him?
I think Whitmer would be a tougher candidate for Trump. As you can imagine, I'm not a huge fan, but you have to give her credit that on her watch, Michigan went from, in 2018, a solidly red state. We controlled every statewide office. We had majorities in the House and the Senate and key congressional seats and other local offices all around the state. And 4 years later, it is blue from top to bottom. The other name that comes up a lot is Gavin Newsom. I don't think Newsom is a national candidate. It's easy to be a hardcore progressive in California. There's no resistance. He's never really had a race. Whitmer has run in some tough races throughout her career. And, this is a bellwether state. Michigan will be instrumental in deciding the election, and she's won by some pretty good margins in her two races statewide. And she now, because of the Democratic majorities in the House and the Senate, has a record to run on, which she didn't over the first 4 years. So I actually think she'd be a pretty formidable national candidate.
Patrick Ruffini, you agree?
I mean, I think at this point, I think that the challenge that Joe Biden has been having politically, does go back to, the doubts about his age, his vitality, his capacity. And so while I think he has been identified, right, as this pro-labor, old throwback Democrat to the days when, the Democrats were, primarily identified as the party of the working class, the challenge that I think Joe Biden has had specifically is projecting that same level of passion, right? And maybe a little bit of what you saw from Gretchen Whitmer, but what you also saw from Barack Obama, what you see from Bernie Sanders. And I think in these settings, that's really important. So while I think, again, Joe Biden, I think, is actually cognizant of a lot of the problems his party is facing, appealing to working class voters. It is not able to connect because the energy doesn't seem to be there in quite the same way.
Alan Kuntz, do you wish it was a Gretchen Whitmer running for the Democrats next year instead of a Joe Biden?
Oh, we have such a wish list, but we have to deal with the reality on the ground. Gretchen Whitmer would be great. She survived an extraordinary event that we mustn't forget. Back in April of 2020, there was actually an attempt to kidnap her, sequester her. It was carried out by a paramilitary group right there in Michigan, and it was saved at the last minute by the FBI. After the January 6th at the state capitol, so it was like a dry run for that, for the state capitol, and 13 of those men were since indicted and incarcerated. So there's kind of a case study there of what can happen if, there's not swift justice, and she survived that event literally and figuratively quite well. There was the Republican debate last night when you're talking about, other candidates. So it's kind of, the fact that Trump doesn't participate in the Republican debates is kind of interesting. There was DeSantis, who has kind of no effect with his Make America Florida pitch, which isn't working. And I strongly felt that Nikki Haley was making an excellent run for vice president.
Is that your feeling, Patrick Ruffini? That, it's true that we're more than two-thirds of the way through the show, and we haven't yet mentioned the Republican candidates debate just because Donald Trump is such a favorite?
I think it was an interesting debate, right? I think in many ways a little bit chaotic, but I do think that you did see the candidates actually, I think, recognizing some of the urgency now in a way that I don't think they did at the very first debate, in terms of DeSantis in particular going after Donald Trump directly, right? When he really wouldn't say his name before. You have more candidates doing that. Now, whether or not that will be enough, right, that remains to be seen. But you certainly, I think, from some of these candidates are seeing them trying to amp up the rhetoric a little bit as it relates to Trump. But I think they're going to have to do it some more if they're going to catch him in the polls.
Yeah, the rivals for the Republican nomination at the Reagan Library in California, and it did feel at times like it was a best of the rest candidates debate.
Donald Trump is missing in action. He should be on this stage tonight. He owes it to you.
Jason Rowe, did you watch the debate last night?
I was blessed to have a conflict that prevented me, and when I watched the news this morning, I don't feel like I missed a whole lot. It sounded like a lot of talking over each other, and it's unfortunate because there's a number of those candidates that are highly qualified and I think would be great nominees for Republicans, but the reality is Donald Trump is sucking up all the oxygen, and whether I agree with his decision to participate in the debates or not, I think his not participating is working to his advantage, because just like the tone of this conversation about kind of the irrelevancy of the field, that's the reality. By not participating, he has made these debates almost non-events in the process. And we're just about 100 days before the Iowa caucuses. So the clock is ticking for these candidates to make their mark. And at some point, some are going to have to drop out and some consolidation will occur. But back 8 years ago, Donald Trump was pulling about 30 to 35% of the vote at this time in the process, and now he's pulling about 60%. So he's in a much stronger position than he was 8 years ago, and he defied conventional wisdom then, and I expect he will probably be the nominee unless something extraordinary happens. And I don't even know what extraordinary is anymore.
Yeah, we've seen we've talked about the vulnerabilities of the incumbent. Will the next election hinge on personality? Will it hinge on the economy that we've talked about? Or will it hinge on social issues? Today happens to be International Safe Abortion Day around the world, and the focus turning to the battle over reproductive rights. Democrats in the Michigan legislature want to roll back restrictions on abortion, just like they scored a win with last November when 55% of Michigan voters approved a ballot initiative that creates a state constitutional right to reproductive freedom. Democrats cut their losses, Jason Rowe, at the midterm elections on this single issue, abortion, a lot of times. Once again, is that what's going to put Joe Biden over the top in 2024?
I don't know at the federal level. I guess it depends on what the Republican nominee has as a position on a federal ban. For decades, the pro-life movement has argued that this is an issue should be left to the states, and in many states it is now settled law. In Michigan, it's now in the Constitution. So I don't think it'll have the potency that it had last year. It'll be probably more of a state-level fight, but that really depends on how the Republican candidate nominee ends up using that issue as part of their platform.
You agree, Cole Stanley?
I mean, I think the problem the Republicans have is that saying that they want to overturn Roe v. Wade is something that works to turn out the base, get the Republican base amped up about turning out in elections. It's quite an effective strategy to mobilize their voters. Unfortunately for them, and fortunately for the rest of us in the United States and around the world, majority of Americans do believe that we should have protected right to have an abortion, and it makes it very difficult for the Republicans to now have to be in this uncomfortable position that maybe a lot of them didn't necessarily even want to be in.
But you heard Jason's point that it may not be the issue the way it turned out to be, and it was a surprise that it turned out to be to that extent the issue in the midterm elections.
Yeah, I mean, I do agree with Jason to the extent that I think Trump is the Republican candidate, almost certainly Trump is in a pretty good position vis-a-vis Biden, because if you look at the general economic picture, you look at the lack of enthusiasm. The Democrats are sort of hoping again that this abortion issue will mobilize voters to the polls. But if you look at opinion polls right now, young people aren't particularly enthused about voting for Joe Biden again, and so it's going to be difficult. I think the Democrats need to do more than just talk about how the scary Republicans are going to continue to take more important rights away from people.
Ellen Kuntz?
I think that most people can vote on something besides enthusiasm. The enthusiasm of the Obama elections was like a once-in-a-lifetime event. People can vote lethargically, but the important thing is they vote. As Francois said earlier, came out in droves, 71%.
Will it be 71% in a state like Michigan in 2024?
I think that people have been mobilized politically, and now it's kind of on their radar in ways that it wasn't before.
Because that was one of the big surprises in 2020. Yes, Donald Trump lost, but he also got many more votes than he got in 2016.
Yes, but so many more people voted and also were eligible to vote. We have to look at you were talking about numbers before, we have to talk about statistics of who turns 18, how many millions of people turn 18 and become eligible to vote in any particular voting year. It would be great, and it's true for our European listeners to know that what a challenge it is to vote in America, because it's during the week, during the workday, no time off, sometimes standing 8 hours in line. In the southern states, they're trying to now make decisions about not being able to have water or standing on line or no food. So there are a lot of things that discourage people from coming out to vote. It's not facilitated the way it is in Europe. And citizens have to be really determined to make sure that their voice is heard. And at the same time, also, of course, we vote for a lot of things all at once, certainly next year. So you're going to have what are called down ballot candidates. That would be everything from, local judges and your dog catcher to, in some states, the governor, and in other states, senators.
Patrick Ruffini, why can't you vote on a Sunday?
Well, that's a law that goes way, way back in history. But though, I mean, we've had really much increased turnout in elections in recent years, in particularly, in this era of Donald Trump. You've seen just a surge in turnout, a surge in voting. Maybe not quite where Europe is, but certainly much higher. As a result, that kind of makes it a little bit difficult for any one single issue to really shape the electorate from election to election. If you have everybody who is so alarmed all the time on virtually every issue, that adding a new issue like abortion into the mix in a presidential election year, doesn't necessarily have the same impact that it can in a special election, in a midterm election like we saw last year in Michigan and a lot of states. Now, that doesn't mean Democrats aren't going to try. You're going to see abortion issues on the ballot in states like Arizona and states like Pennsylvania. They're really trying to push very hard to get it on the ballot in battleground states to recreate some of that success that they did have in Michigan last time. But we shall see if it works as well in a presidential year when turnout will be extremely high.
Jason Rowe, a question for you about Michigan again, because we're sort of paying a closer attention to it, and you're the former chair of the Republican Party there. You heard Ellen Kuntz talking about changing demographics. How has Michigan changed?
Well, our demographics are changing in that people are leaving the state. We actually lost another congressional seat because of the redistricting process based on the census. We lost one the previous census, and we lost one in the previous. So there has been a constant flow of people out of the state. I don't think it's affected the demographic composition of, minority representation, et cetera, so much. But it's been such a problem that the governor just had to create a commission to try to convince people not to leave the state of Michigan, which I think is, what's going on in the state economically is driving people to other states. I do think it's more about the realignment of the traditional coalitions. The Democrats now represent the elites, and the Republicans now are speaking more to the working class voters. And I think that's one of the reasons that Trump was successful in 2016. I think that's why the state was close in 2020, when in the previous decades we've not been competitive. So I think it's less about demographic change and more about the realignment of the traditional party coalitions.
We had an incumbent who spent all these billions on this subsidy plan. It's called the Inflation Reduction Act, Cole Stangler. And yet there is that perception that Jason Rowe mentions of who's on which side.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, it's important to just be a little precise about what we're talking about here. Okay, so in the United States, when we say the working class, we're talking about, again, white voters that don't have college degrees. It's an important demographic, but that's essentially what we're talking about. Trump had a tremendous amount of support, does have a tremendous amount of support from that part of the electorate, a chunk of the working class. And
he got some Hispanic voters as well.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. But it's also important to keep in mind when we're talking about turnout as well. And in France, in Europe, we talk a lot about the low the increasing abstention rate, people that don't vote. It's true in the U.S. we've seen a surge in turnout in the last 2 election cycles. But overall, you compare it to Europe, you still have fewer shares of the population voting in the United States, which is to say there's a lot of people, and especially among lower income voters, that feel completely disillusioned from the political process. So I think, yes, it's true. Trump does have a chunk of support among a certain part of the electorate, but also there are a lot of voters in that demographic that are completely disillusioned with politics. And I think that's the question that Democrats need to be asking themselves. How do you get those people excited and energized about politics? We've seen, various attempts to do that. Bernie Sanders, is a very successful, popular politician on the Democratic side, or independent but associated with the Democrats. Mm-hmm. That's kind of one method that I think has been pretty effective. The problem is the Democrats don't have a big backbench, so to speak. They have Biden, who's supposed to be a kind of caretaker presidency, who's now decided he's going to run again. And they don't really have a lot of other options. That, to me, is very alarming if you're on the Democratic side. What are you going to do? This election cycle is looking a little dicey, and then after that, the Democrats don't have a lot of these figures that can get people excited about politics.
I would agree with you that we don't have a great backbench, but There's always surprises. And one thing that I am a bit worried about with President Biden running again, and I agree with you, he did say he wasn't going to do so, is the fact that the last time we voted, we were in the middle of a pandemic and everything was Zoomed. And he didn't have to literally run around.
Yeah.
It's like a marathon to run for president.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of thinking, that age issue, which is always very uncomfortable and a bit indecent almost to speak about. But your average 80-year-old, it's about getting to the supermarket, let alone visiting all 50 states for the next 14 months. I don't know how feasible that is.
And Jason Rowe, one quick final point, because we're out of time. You talked about the 60% approval ratings for Trump among Republican voters. Ellen Koontz wondering aloud about Biden's stamina on the campaign trail. When do things have to be fixed and set in stone? Is it January, February, or could there be surprises even later?
Well, there's ballot access rules for every state, and I can't rattle those off for you here, but I have to think that, by the end of November, if there's not other candidates or there's not significant moments that have taken place, given Iowa is going to be in the middle of January, you're not far off from this thing, the bell ringing and this thing going. And I do think if Trump doesn't, go to jail or something happened that derails him, might have this sewn up as early as March.
Jason Rowe, many thanks for joining us from St. Louis. I want to thank as well Patrick Ruffini in Washington, Ellen Koontz, Cole Stangler. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.